The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the first chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
As soon as Jesus and the disciples left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told Jesus about her at once. He came and he took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sunset, they brought to Jesus all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, Jesus got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." Jesus answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also. For that is what I came out to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
All right, before I get myself in trouble, how many Star Wars fans are there here today? Okay, a couple, not too many. I will confess that I've never really gotten into that whole series or seen hardly any of those films, but the kids and I watched the original Star Wars just the other night, and I think I've seen that one before, but it's gotten me thinking a little bit about some of this, because there's always this ever-pressing question when it comes to this series and this whole thing of Star Wars. This question that if there is somebody who has never seen any of the Star Wars films, but they wanted to start watching them, do they begin with the first one that was ever made? Or do they begin with the beginning of the story? Okay, I'm going to try and get this right. Now, the first one that was ever made was technically number 4 in the scope of the story, right? Okay, so this original trilogy was number 4 and 5 and 6, which was then followed by newer movies, which were number 1, 2, and 3 in the story. With me? So do you watch them in that order, or do you watch them in the story order, the chronological order of that whole scope of the story, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? There is a grand debate about this, and I bet the 3 people who raised their hand each have a different opinion. As I was thinking about this and kind of researching a little bit, I learned a new phrase, though. It's a phrase called, that says, in medias res. It's Latin, okay? In medias res, which means into the middle of things. Into the middle. So this original Star Wars movie, as I was saying, it was made in 1977, 47 years ago, if you want to feel old right now. And that original movie starts, the storyline of it starts in medias res, in the middle of the scope of the whole story. In this first movie, there's already a story happening. There's already a galactic empire and a rebel alliance that have been fighting with each other. There's already this concept of the Force that's been passed down through generations. It begins, as I said, so much so in the middle of the story that they were able to create an entire trilogy ahead of this story, leading into it. So it's an obvious example of this concept in medias res, but it's not just limited to Star Wars. We see examples of this kind of concept all throughout literature and the arts, all through history. When it's used in those ways, it becomes a part of the story. It's part of how they tell the story. It's a part of the plot. In some way in that movie or book or whatever, the writers and creators somehow will help us understand the beginning so that we can make sense of where we are in the middle. Okay? The challenge of this concept, though, is when we're unintentionally dropped into the middle of the story and don't really have this understanding of how we've got there or what has come before. And I think that kind of thing is the challenge of our faith. When we get dropped into the middle of the story of what Jesus is doing without knowing where he's come from or what God has told him to do, if we get dropped in the middle without any of that pre-knowledge, I think we miss out on so much. That's why it's been important for us to circle back year after year to hear the story of Jesus' birth and all of these pieces that surround the start of his ministry, where we've been over these past few weeks. And so here in Mark's gospel that we've been looking at, as we've seen over these few weeks, we first hear a prophecy about the coming Lord from Isaiah. We witness Jesus being baptized. Throughout our weeks, we've skipped a few of those verses. We're going to come back to them here in Lent in just a couple weeks. But right after Jesus is baptized, he's sent into the wilderness. He's driven into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. After that, he begins to proclaim that God's kingdom has arrived. Jesus calls disciples. He teaches. He preaches. He heals. We hear that people are amazed. His fame begins to spread. That's all the setup to the rest of Jesus' story. We can't forget, though, that this Gospel of Mark, that's where it begins. Mark does not include any birth stories. There's no angels or shepherds or wise men or a manger. It's just John the Baptist, baptism, and here we go. Either Mark is making an assumption that the ones hearing or reading his story already know about Jesus' birth, or Mark thinks that these pieces that he's telling us about are enough to show who Jesus is. So let's think about if that was the case. In knowing that Jesus was being baptized and sent to face temptations, if we know that that's an important part of the story, the beginning of the story, we see from the get-go that his work and his life are focused on those who need forgiveness and those who will face worldly temptations. That helps us to see and understand why he's so fond of hanging out with sinners and tax collectors, why he spends so much time with the brokenhearted and the hurting. He doesn't call rich nobles to be a part of his followers. He calls ordinary fishermen out of their daily work. He gravitates towards those who are physically infirm and sick. And so from all of those things, we're starting to see that Jesus comes and he arrives to break into the ordinariness of life. If you remember last week, we heard the story of Jesus in the synagogue. He was teaching, and as he was doing so, a man with an unclean spirit enters and confronts Jesus, and Jesus amazes everybody by healing this man. Jesus rebukes this unclean spirit, and the spirit leaves the man. And from seeing that, Jesus' fame begins to spread. And so now, in today's story that we heard, they're done at the synagogue. It's the same day. This current small band of disciples that Jesus has called so far, they take Jesus to one of their houses. And there was Simon's mother-in-law, sick in bed with a fever. They tell Jesus about her, and without hesitation, Jesus goes in to see her. He takes her by the hand. He lifts her up and causes the fever to leave her. Another act of healing. Obviously, people liked this. They thought it was pretty cool, because then, as we heard that evening at sunset, they, whether it's the disciples or everyone who's been hearing about him, we don't know, but they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons. And the whole city was gathered around the door. And Jesus cured many who were sick with various diseases, and he cast out many demons. Even after that, the next morning, after he had gone out to pray, we hear that he continues his ministry, going throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out more demons. We need to see this as a great intro of who Jesus is and what he's come to do. Right? Knowing all these things give us so much hope, don't they? Hope that Jesus will be with us no matter how big of sinners we are. Hope that Jesus will accompany us through our struggles with temptation, knowing that he faced those very same issues. Hope that Jesus, by approaching him and believing in him, can bring wholeness and healing. And that's the tough one, though, isn't it? That part of the story should amaze us like it did those who were gathered with him in the synagogue, witnessing him as he casts out demons and heals the sick. I feel like we live in hope that we might witness that same kind of healing. I know we fall on our knees in prayer, relentlessly praying for that kind of healing. We beg God, we plead with God to bring healing to our broken bodies. We search for these kinds of miracles that we hear about over and over in the Bible, and yet, here we are, still witnessing pain and hurt and brokenness and sickness, still experiencing those things within ourselves, still watching as our friends and our loved ones suffer and die. I mean, have you ever had a moment where you have lost hope for healing? You hope for the miracles that seem to come on a regular basis for those who are following Jesus, but yet you never seem to get that same thing. I think that is the challenge, or dare I say the danger, when it comes to us being dropped in the middle of Jesus' story without knowing all the information that comes beforehand about who he is and who God is and why Jesus has come. We think this kind of miraculous healing is a regular occurrence for those who follow Jesus. If we're dropped right in today's story, and we hear that kind of promise from a lot of churches and church leaders. There are those out here that say, and they promise that you can be healed in the name of Jesus. And if you pray just this way and you don't get healed, well, something's wrong. You're doing it wrong. What about us? There's a Christian writer by the name of Barbara Brown Taylor, and she addresses this challenge within us, and she writes that the problem with miracles is that it's hard to witness them without wanting one for ourselves. Every one of us knows someone who is suffering. Every one of us knows someone who could use a miracle, but miracles are hard to come by. So what are we supposed to do with these healing stories? Now, this is not meant to diminish any kind of miraculous healing that we might attribute to God, but it's more about asking, what about us? Why not us? Well, maybe healing was not the main thing for Jesus. We heard that the whole city had gathered outside of where Jesus was. When they heard about these healings, they came to him hoping to be healed and cured. And when Jesus came out, Mark tells us that many were healed, and he cast out many demons. He didn't say all were healed and all the demons were cast out. No, he said many. I mean, it sounds like that maybe there were some people who were there that day and they walked away wondering why they hadn't been healed. Could Jesus not do it? Did he run out of time? Was I not close enough? Was I not important enough? We get caught up on that. But we have to think that maybe that's not the whole point. Jesus never glamorized or bragged about how he could heal. In fact, most of the time when he did it, he did not want the attention from doing it. He told the people not to say anything, and he commanded the unclean spirits that had left not to speak about him. So as tough as it can be, I think we're meant not to look for the magic power of Jesus, but to live in this mystery of it. To know that the things he did while on this earth were meant to point to an even bigger reality of what God is doing. Again, this is not meant to diminish what Jesus did when he came here. It's rather to say that this is only the middle of the story. It's a reminder and a call to live graciously and compassionately here in this in-between time, to live in hope. Because we know the beginning of the story. We know, or at least we've caught a glimpse of who God is and why God sent Jesus, why Jesus has come to us. The prophet Isaiah that we heard earlier reminds us of this hope that we have in who God is. Isaiah said that the Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint. He strengthens the powerless. Those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. We may be caught in the middle of this story, but we know the beginning, and we've seen points to the end. We know what God is bringing to this kingdom and to us. And so thanks be to God for that hope that we do indeed have. Amen.